Welcome back to the Postpartum Plan podcast. This podcast is designed to support and empower you through postpartum. Whether you're expecting, in the early postpartum days, or beyond, this space is for you. I'm your host, Madison Fugere, a dedicated postpartum doula and pediatric sleep consultant, striving to help parents feel confident and supported in their parenting journey. Each week, I'm sharing practical tips and expert advice to help you navigate all the postpartum things with confidence. Well, as much confidence as you can. Let's embark on this journey together, making your parenthood as serene and supportive as possible. Laura is a women's healthcare nurse practitioner, menopause specialist, coach, and the owner of Sapphire Women's Healthcare. She's also a wife and mom of 2 little ones. She loves working with women across their lifespan, but is especially passionate about women's sexual health, perimenopause, and menopause. Hi, Laura. I'm so excited to have you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I literally was even more thrilled, I think, over the fact that we had talked at an amazing meetup. And then you were like, yeah, I'll come on the podcast. And one of the questions for finding a time slot to record is like, what topic are you wanting to talk about? And you had brought up wanting to talk about intimacy after like joining the parenthood club, right?
Yeah.
And I literally was like, yes, 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 yes. I think every single one of my clients, postpartum, I've talked to them about this. There we go. And even sleep consulting clients, when I'm supporting them, a lot of the time I want to get my kid out of my bed, or I want to get my kid out of my room.
Yeah.
You can only be so creative. So yeah, I think that this is a topic that so many people are, experiencing and struggling with. So I'm so happy and excited to have you come and like tackle it with me.
Yeah. So I'll give a little background about myself.
That's perfect.
I'm a women's health nurse practitioner, and I recently opened up my own practice focusing mostly on perimenopause and menopause. So not too many people probably overlap from our 2 audiences, but women are certainly having babies much older now, and so they might transition from postpartum right into perimenopause. But I also I am passionate about sexual health too. Men have all sorts of tools, and we're allowed to talk about their sex lives all the time. But for women, it's very taboo still. We're making a lot of changes, but I think I know personally after I had my 2 kids, and then also working for several years in the OBGYN field, intimacy after having a baby is a huge concern for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I can launch into all the science if you want to know about that.
I love it. Well, and I think that the biggest thing that people get nervous about is like, yeah, especially partners, and like if we're gonna gender stereotype it, I find it's often males, right? Are so quick to being like, oh yeah, go to that 6-week appointment, get cleared, right?
Yeah.
All they're waiting for is this doctor's okay. And I think for a lot of people that have just given birth, like the idea of your partner just wanting you to go get okay from the doctors and not having like a physical human relationship conversation about it is the part that's like missing in a lot of these situations.
Absolutely. Like I would tell my patients all the time when I would see them for their 6 weeks postpartum, I would say 6 weeks is a really arbitrary number, probably made up by the insurance companies who are largely men. I would not expect you to be fully recovered, whether it was a cesarean section birth or a vaginal delivery, by 6 weeks. Really, at 6 weeks, we're hoping that your bleeding has stopped, and that your uterus has involuted, so it's gotten back to its pre-pregnancy size. And so essentially, when we see those things, we know that your risk for infection is really minimal. So that's why we kind of have that number there. But oh my gosh, especially I think for first time moms, this is a huge transition, and there's so much that you're learning. And like, no, I'm sorry, you're not an expert at 6 weeks. No, nobody is. First time moms or 6 time moms, it's every time you're a new mom. You might have already had 3 kids, but this is the first time that you've had 4 kids. And so I think it's really important that we give ourselves a lot of grace in every aspect of motherhood. And then, especially when it comes to intimacy, I think, I heard all the time, people are like, oh, so am I cleared? And they were generally much more excited to be cleared to go back to exercise than to have
Yeah.
sex again.
Right? I think
Yeah.
that's so true. So well, first, I think yes, like people are so excited to have like happy adrenaline and like exercise. So I
Mhm.
think that's my big thing on that 6 weeks is like, get your clearance that you're needing for your own mental health, right? And then the idea of like the intimacy within a relationship having to be sex specifically, I think is also something that people are forgetting that isn't true, right? Um, I have my postpartum workbook that I tell people to, do. And I just actually revamped it and added a ton of questions. And one of the whole pages is like a personal reflection and then a partnership like conversation of talking about, okay, what can we need? What do I need? What do you need? And then like, okay, what works for us? And like, what types of intimacy outside of having sex is something that's going to make our lives and our relationship still strong, right? And I
Mhm.
think people forget about that part of it as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's again that arbitrary like 6 week thing of like, cool that the doctor said yes, but there's another person involved in this relationship,
Right?
and she's actually the one whose body you'd be having sex with. So like,
Right.
you need to really build that up. And so a lot of times, I think part of it for many women is like, is it going to hurt?
Yep.
There's definitely fear, and so anytime that you have fear around intimacy, especially penetrative intercourse, your brain is going to tell your body something, and oftentimes that can actually make things more uncomfortable.
Right.
I kind of put it like, you're not going to crave stubbing your toe. So if you're very afraid of having sex because you're afraid it might hurt, your libido is not going to be there. It's going to
Right.
really take some time as a couple to work back into that intimacy to even bridge the gap of any kind of physical touch. And so a lot of times I would tell people like, if you're nervous about it, just like start off with a good old fashioned seventh grade makeout session,
Yeah.
or even I mean, I think looking back to my two postpartum experiences, I don't think my husband and I were holding hands. Like we were not a couple in those first 6 weeks. We were
Right.
surviving. We were
You're
hanging on by
you're
a
quite
thread.
literally like roommates. You're coexisting. And for a lot of
Yeah.
the time, like the idea of being able to sleep in the same bed and be close to each other is great. But like when you're sleep deprived, and for a lot of parents, they do shifts at night. So like,
Oh, absolutely.
if you're in bed and you're sleeping for 4 hours and your partner has the baby in the living room and then they trade with you and maybe you're in the nursery or like you're on call, like you're not connected as like a relationship. You're two separate human beings. You're quite literally roommates.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was definitely our experience. We figured out that the best thing for us to maximize our sleep was to do the shift work. And
Yeah.
so we had our bassinet on wheels, and one of us would stay in the master bedroom and one of us would stay in the guest bedroom. And halfway
Yep.
through, we would just wheel the baby in like it was a drink cart. Here you go. Like your
Oh
turn's
my
up.
gosh.
Um, so yeah, I mean, and I know for me, like when my husband's not in the bed with me at night, I don't sleep as well. And so there's so many layers of that missing connection
Yeah.
that you really have to like talk to each other about how do we even get back to a place of like wanting this. And the other thing
Yes.
I'll share is, for there's two different desire types. So there's spontaneous desire where you just sort of realize like, oh yeah, I could do that. And then there's responsive desire where you almost need to be like in the moment, like having started the makeout session to go, oh, that's right, I do enjoy this. And typically, especially in heterosexual relationships, men have the spontaneous desire, not always, but that is the vast majority,
Yep.
whereas women have that responsive desire type. And so which is not to say men should just jump on you and start doing stuff, but just to remember that like, just again, sort of building back up to that of like, all right, like let's start with the hand holding on the couch and and then we can build our way up to, just hugging for longer and finding intimate ways or touching in non-sexual ways throughout the day, even just sort of get your body's receptors back used to that. Because I know even still, my kids are 5.5 and 3. And on days where they are driving me nuts, I told my husband I can honestly feel my receptors filling up. And if he comes anywhere near me, even just for like a pat on the low back kind of thing, I bristle. I cringe and I'm like, oh
Yes.
God, he's gonna expect it. And I don't want to give him any of those signs that
Yeah.
I'm receptive to it. And so I think, opening that conversation, and by no means have we been perfect at this. It's definitely been um, a
It's
long
hard.
road to figuring out how to communicate about this thing. But I think that's what's missing, whether your parents or not. So many people just don't even know how to talk about sex.
Yeah.
And so, of course, when you're in the battlefield of the newborn phase
Mm-hmm.
and sleep deprived, and if you're breastfeeding, that's a whole job in and of itself.
Right.
Um, I think, of course, that communication in general goes by the wayside because you're just trying to survive. But when you also try to add in that layer of intimacy, um, I think it can be even more difficult and feel scary to have that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that like the other side of things with like the spontaneous and the responsive is also the idea of like the equal load of like just the
Mm.
mental load in life of itself too, right? I've heard so many moms of mine that I've worked with be like, yeah, I got cleared. Like all like my husband just like expects me to come home and just jump in bed. And she's like, but how do I do that when, I've been the one breastfeeding. I've been the one getting up in the middle of the night. I've been the one that hears the baby cry. I've been the one that the baby wants and can soothe the baby. And he's over here like, yeah, maybe he washes the bottles or whatever. Or, oh, maybe he does get up at once and tries to like help me and so I can get some sleep. But like, there's some like jealousy there, which is super. I mean, you said you kind of know the science of things too, but like, I mean, it's hormonally like normal. It's very common, right? And I think that, being kind of like, ugh, annoyed or jealous, or like, the memes that people say, like, I want to sleep on my husband's side of the bed because he can't hear the baby cry from over there. Like, like all of those types of things I think are so true and so real. But for a lot of women, like it is that responsive. And it's also the idea of like not just wanting to all of a sudden jump right into it, right? Like you want that, like you want things to be organized and life to feel equal before you can like kind of feel like you're in a mental space to be able to have sex, right?
Right. And then there's also a connection, right? So some people, and again, stereotypically it is men, have sex to feel connection. And part of that is patriarchy and toxic masculinity because
Right.
they've been socialized. That is how they connect. That's how they can feel their feelings. Whereas women, we like to talk about things. And
Yeah.
so often we need to feel connected before we feel like we want to have any kind of
A
physical
hundred
touch.
percent.
So it's and I have to say, not just from my own personal bias, but I do think that those people win in the end. There that those needs have to be addressed in order to feel safe. Taking those physical intimacy steps. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so I think it's doing a self-assessment individually and as a couple of like, okay, what are our desire types, and are we and almost never are they the same thing? So it's very rare
Right.
that both people have responsive or both people have spontaneous desire. And same with the connection piece is that it's again very very common for the women to need that emotional connection in order to want to have intimacy. And so I think it's a taking that assessment yourself and then making sure that your partner does the same, and communicating about it. So I think sometimes too, having podcasts like this, you could just be like, hey, let's listen to this together, and that way
Yeah.
it doesn't feel quite so awkward. It can be so hard to bring it up when you've never talked about these things before, and
Right.
this is a big deal for a lot of people. It's a really important part of life and connection. And so I think, learning how to talk about that, as you're learning to do all of these other things with a new baby in the house, just add it to the list. Why not? You got nothing else going
Right.
on.
Right. I know I typically say that though. Like, I love that. Like, yeah, listen to it together. Like, some people will say, like, oh, my partner doesn't really like something's going on, but I can't really figure out what it is. Or, like, they need to know this. Or, like, I've said it a million times, but they don't hear it. I often will send them podcasts and I'm like, here, like, if they'll say, tell them Madison said to listen to this. Like, like,
Yeah.
or even I'll send it to them and be like, hey, take a listen to this. I think it might be helpful for you. Right.
Oh yeah.
So on that note, I'd love to, like, even I don't know if you have any specific things that you normally have people kind of like talk about, but like if someone were to be listening right now and maybe they're like not knowing how to start this conversation with their partner, or if partners are listening like in tandem right now, could we list off like a couple questions that maybe they could discuss together to like help them identify, what types of needs each of them have or things like that? Maybe we just kind of like, list off a few and kind of move next to the next thing, but that way it gives people somewhere to kind of open that conversation and dialogue.
Yeah. So I think sometimes it's not even necessarily questions, but like just open the conversation using the I statements, because I think we do get very defensive around these sorts of things. And in any kind of couples communication, it's helpful to use the I statement. So for instance, um, my first pregnancy, I wound up having an emergency C-section, and I think sometimes because there's a very visible scar, and that recovery can be a lot. I think that's easier for people to kind of respect those boundaries. But then my second, I delivered vaginally, and had some tearing and scarring, and I was really, really nervous about having sex again. And I told my husband, I was like, "Listen, I want to have sex with you. I do not want it yet, and
Yeah.
I need you to respect that and to understand. I'm really scared. It's I'm worried it's going to hurt, and I'm worried that it's going to put up a barrier between us." And I think, voicing your concerns is a really, it's vulnerable, but it's a beautiful way to create some of that connection. So I think that's really important. And then, allowing room for everyone to feel their feelings. No one's right or wrong in their
Right.
feelings, but respecting those. And so my husband was wonderful and wonderfully supportive. And I also knew that he was hoping that we could get intimate a little sooner than I was ready. But
Right.
again, then we talked about like, okay, yeah, but like I need a lot of other things too. It's not just that I'm afraid and we should power through this. But also talking about lubrication, because no one talks about that in general, but especially postpartum, that's so important to use.
Mhm.
And especially if you're breastfeeding, because those breastfeeding hormones naturally decrease not just your libido, which is always important to know, but they also decrease your natural vaginal lubrication. So they actually just recently coined a new term called genitourinary syndrome of lactation, which is very similar physiologically to what happens to our vaginal and vulvar tissues when we go through menopause. It's because we have a really decreased level of estrogen, and so
Huh.
we're not producing lubrication naturally, and we can be dry and uncomfortable. The good news is once you stop breastfeeding, that stuff comes back.
That's so cool. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, not for the people experiencing it, but
Well, now I think that's what's great is now we have a name for it, and it's not widespread yet, but I think it's going to come out, and then hopefully that'll make it easier for providers who may not be aware. But it's very safe to use vaginal estrogen cream when you are breastfeeding. That is, it's not going to impact your supply. It's not systemically absorbed, but it can sort of plump the tissue back up. It can help with lubrication and your pH, so you're not worried as much about getting infections.
yeah.
And so it's super, super safe. I have my breastfeeding moms on it. Typically, I'll have them start like with a nightly dose, um, and not necessarily right away, but within 6 weeks of giving birth, typically. And then a nightly dose for 2 to 6 weeks, and then just continue twice a week until you're done breastfeeding. And it just makes everything a little less uncomfortable. It also reduces your risk of UTIs, so that's great.
That's awesome. So
No one
cool.
wants to have sex when you have a UTI.
I love it. I love it. And then one of the things kind of like you brought up a little bit is like obviously a lot of this has to do with like feelings, emotions, conversational things. And I think that also brings us to like the idea of like postpartum mood disorders, right? As well, because I think that they have always existed, but people really never knew what to call it, or people thought they just were having these baby blues. And I think now we're a little bit more known. Hopefully, if people are listening to this podcast, it means they've listened to like other topics and so they know about it. But the idea of having postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, there's postpartum psychosis, there's so many different things. And I think that also noting that it's not just the person who's given birth, like partners, husbands, like it's also really common to have postpartum mood disorders for them as well. And so I think that part of it is also like that emotional side of things too, right? Like hormones are increased, but also so is everything else. And so I think that remembering and acknowledging those types of things and getting help for those types of things as well can be, truly beneficial when it comes to being able to communicate with your partner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're doing a better job of screening for postpartum depression. I think the last few years, I've really seen the conversation grow significantly around it, which is beautiful. But we're not talking as much about the anxiety, which I actually think is probably more prevalent than the depression, although they
100%.
often go hand in hand. And
Right.
and then it is like, well, what's a normal anxiety of like how much worrying about my baby because oh my gosh that worry never goes away. There's always something that you're going to be nervous about as a parent. But what's a normal amount of worry versus like what is concerning. And so I would say it's those thoughts that you're ruminating on. You can't sort of get them out of your head, and things that are you can't sort of logic your way out of, right? So like
Right.
I had, I think I had some undiagnosed postpartum anxiety with my first, and a lot of it was around breastfeeding because I didn't have a great supply, and so I was constantly worried about is my baby getting enough, even though we were supplementing with formula, and he was doing fine on that, But it was this pressure that I had internalized that like you are supposed to breastfeed for a whole year,
Yeah.
and I really think that it impacted my bonding with him. I know it impacted my relationship with my husband. He can't get it, and he's never going to be able to get it because he's
Right.
never he's never going to produce breast milk.
Right.
And he tried his best to be supportive, but he just was not going to ever be able to fully put himself in my shoes.
Right.
So I think it is like, all right, if it's more than a week or two of having these thoughts that you're waking up, it's preventing you from sleeping. You can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of your baby because these worries are getting in your way. That's when you need to see somebody.
Right.
And I do think, I've seen at the postpartum visit, we screen people. I know pediatricians tend to do it throughout the first year of life, but you're right. We don't do that for the dad or the
Right.
partners. The non-pregnant or partners don't get that screening. So I think I think a lot of men like the idea of like keeping it on their radar because so many men like to have something to do. But we should be keeping it on our radar for them as well because it's a
Yeah.
huge transition for them, and they may not have the hormonal component. There's some studies going on about that, but it's certainly something, again, connection and intimacy and having each other's backs and being really teammates and partners in this.
Yeah.
I think it's really important for us to be on the lookout for that for them as well.
Yeah. I think that's so true. I think that partners often have a harder time connecting with little tiny newborns as well,
Mhm.
because newborns are instinctively a dyad with the person who birthed them for the first 3 months at least. And they're pretty reliant on them. And often they calm way faster with that person. They are soothed by that person. That person's with them more often. And so, like, I find for partners, especially men, it's really hard for them to connect with that baby sometimes. And
Mhm.
as baby gets older, and especially once they get into toddlerhood, I think that's when men are finally like, oh my gosh, I can play with them. And like that's like
Right.
honestly just how the world is, right? As children, females are always handed babies, and that's just how we
Mhm.
go, but men aren't. So they're not used to it. They can play with the toddlers and feel confident, but oftentimes that creates a difficulty in like bonding with the newborn. And so I think that's also super important to kind of remember is like, you know, partners, specifically dads, often feel like they're doing quote unquote a bad job, right? Or like
Mhm.
they're not doing something right in order to not have that proper relationship with their baby, which then creates this mood disorder, which then can create the just feeling bad as a human and as a dad, which can create the whole issue of the intimacy. It's like a whole rolling snowball.
Oh my God. It's all these like chicken or the egg things, right? Like,
Yep.
okay, is it because of this that happened, or is it because that this
Right.
happened? And really they just all feed into each other. I mean, depression and anxiety are perfect examples.
Yep.
You kind of can't get yourself out of your own way, and it just spirals. So I think
Absolutely.
really, knowing and even I tell people all the time, like even if you're not super concerned about it, it's maybe worth just touching base with somebody.
Yeah.
It's so good to have that team member ready to go when you need them to
Yes.
to come on the ice, like
I love
they're
it.
sitting waiting on the sidelines and they're ready to take their turn and jump in when you need them. So having that already established, especially because it can be very difficult to find somebody and find someone in your network who's accepting new patients. Like it's so abysmal out there.
It's so
So
difficult.
kind of pre-establishing can be really helpful.
Yes, absolutely. It's another page I've got in my workbook. I love it. We're on the same brainwave. It's so true. And making sure that you find someone you like can be so challenging too. So like, oh my gosh, yes. I think this is so great, and I don't want to like overwhelm people with information, but I think it's like so awesome. Yeah, being able to kind of like chat with your partner about who has like the types of desire responses and, who is feeling what way, and using those I statements and kind of like starting low and slow, kind of like you were saying, right? Like holding hands or just making out or whatever it may be. But, even before that 6-week mark, trying to kind of enable and establish some sort of like physical touch in a way that's consistent enough that you don't shudder when your partner tries to touch you because you're so overstimulated, right? And I think people get touched out so easily when you've got a newborn too, because you're constantly skin on skin. So being able to kind of like find little ways to make that a little bit easier is so true. Are there any other things that you typically are telling people about that you wanted to throw in here before we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on sort of the physiological changes, the mood stuff, and then certainly, the lubricant and vaginal estrogen. I think, knowing also some resources can be really helpful,
Absolutely.
and break the ice a little bit too. So one of my favorites is a website called Prosayla, Prosayla. It's mostly aimed at the perimenopausal and menopause community, but they've got great intimacy tips. It's sort of the patient-facing side of a sexual health society. So lots of really good things there. And then, a lot of those authors have Instagram pages and podcasts of their own. So it's a great jumping off to be able to find people. And I think, just sort of giving yourself a lot of grace is really important for so many aspects of this. You're brand new to it. And like I said, it doesn't matter if you have 1 baby or 10 babies, it's new every single time. And so I think giving yourself grace and giving your partner grace and, just really keeping those lines of communication open is so, so, so important to every aspect of your health, but especially if you're hoping to ever get back in the bedroom without a baby there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's so true. I appreciate that. And I will add all of those resources in the show notes below as well. And you can find Laura's information below so you can reach out to her and, ask any questions or, get some help. But I think that that's so amazing. I appreciate you coming to kind of like chat on this topic. Like I said, I think so many people are, struggling, and I love that we are able to give them resources to help them work through it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. I love this.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Postpartum Plan podcast. I hope that today's episode brought you support, relatability, and valuable insight. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review and share with any of your prenatal and postpartum friends and family. Your feedback helps us reach more parents seeking support. And if you're looking for additional resources, please feel free to connect via Instagram at Serene Moments Doula for constant information, tips, and tricks, or check out my website, www.serenemomentsdoula.com. See you next week.